subscribe.
All right. Thank you very much. You know, I really appreciate that applause. I used to get a lot of applause back in the 1980s. I had some New York Times national best-selling books. I sold hundreds of thousands of books. Back in the 1980s, I was with one of the biggest publishers in the country, and I was within the top 5% of their sales as far as authors are concerned. And towards the end of the 80s, they came to me and they said, McDougall, I'll tell you what, we think you've done really well, and we're real happy that you're one of our authors, but we see the times are changing. We think that this high carbohydrate, low protein stuff that you're teaching is on the way out, and we predict that high protein diets are the future. And I looked at this person, I said, it could never be. It couldn't possibly be. I mean, the scientific literature is absolutely clear that we should be eating a plant-based diet with lots of carbohydrates. We should stay away from those high-protein, high-fat meats and so on. Everybody knows this. You have to search for days to find articles to show you otherwise. And the science is there. People couldn't possibly come to the other conclusion. And they said, yeah, we believe that. And so what we want you to do is we want you to start writing books about high-protein, low-carbohydrate diets. I said, do you think I just do this for a living? You don't think I believe in what I do? How could you ask me to do this? And they said, well, you're going to have to, McDougall. We believe you're of the 80s, and the high-protein diets are of the 90s. And I laughed, but I was wrong. High-protein diets became the craze in the 90s. Low-carbohydrate diets, that's what all your friends are on, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about, is the low-carb craze, which I consider mass insanity. They say that over half the U.S. population is either on a low-carb diet, has tried a low-carb diet, or plans to try a low-carb diet in the future. Well, you know that's true. Look at your friends and relatives. That's what they're eating. The Atkins diet, the South Beach diet, the Zone diet, Sugar Busters diet. Get those carbs out of your diet, they say. You look in the grocery store, and it's low-carb everything. Low-carb ketchup, low-carb breads, low-carb beer, low-carb everything. That's where the profits are. Everybody's looking for low-carb. Even in the restaurants, they have low-carb items on the menu. I think the farthest this has been carried is by TGIF Fridays. They have an Atkins-approved menu, and they advertise sizzling New York steak with blue cheese and a bunless burger. They'll leave the buns in the kitchen and leave the ketchup off for you so that you can eat this low-carb diet. And I guess that would be okay, except in some of their materials that they had on their website, they made a statement that I really believe steps far beyond just the suggestion you should eat this kind of diet to lose weight. This is what they said. They said this not only helps you lose weight, but reduces risk factors associated with serious diseases, including diabetes and heart disease. Can you imagine they're telling you to eat fat and cholesterol and meat to reduce your risk of heart disease and diabetes? I mean, that is absolutely radical and ludicrous. I hope somebody takes them to task for that. I think they certainly should. But it even gets more ridiculous. How about Burpee, the seed seller? Burpee tells us that they now have a line of low-carbohydrate seeds that you can buy. In other words, nature made a mistake. To design plants with carbohydrate was a mistake of nature. And Burpee's, the seed seller, they're going to correct that by identifying and heading you toward low-carbohydrate varieties of seeds that you can plant. Well, that's what the pressure comes from society, from people who are trying to lose weight, and people are desperate. Now, they're overweight, they're looking for a solution, and anything that will take a few pounds off, get them into their bathing suit by summer, they figure is worth a try, even if they're going to sacrifice their health to lose a few pounds. All kinds of books. In fact, these are the ones that are face out when you go into the bookstores. You'll have a hard time finding a McDougall book or an Ornish book or a Pritikin book. They'll be there, but they're in the back of the bookshelf. Instead, you'll find books by Atkins and South Beach Diet and Sugar Busters and Zone. They're the ones that are so popular these days. In the short term, the problem is these kinds of diets are going to result in constipation, aggravation of hemorrhoids, fatigue, and if they're the more severe kind and you stay on them for a little bit longer, what will happen is you'll get dehydrated, acidosis, you'll lose your appetite, you'll get nauseated. In other words, these are the symptoms of sickness. You'll become sick in the short term. In the long term, these kinds of diets that promote meat and dairy products and not enough plant foods, these diets result in heart disease, strokes, cancer, kidney failure, kidney stones, osteoporosis, and a whole slew of problems that are common to your friends and neighbors. But anything just to lose a few pounds. People are so desperate. And you know, I believe most people who go on these diets, they know this. I also think these diets are failures in terms of weight loss. And I say that because of this fact. Obesity has increased in the United States at the same time that these diets have ruled. I told you since the 1990s they were the best sellers. Well, let's look at what happens to obesity in this country. Between 1991 and 1998, the risk of obesity went from 12 to 18%. And they say today that as many as 26 to 30% of people are obese. They tell us about 2/3 of adults are too fat for their own health in this country. And this has escalated during the time when high-protein diets have ruled. Let me talk to you about these kinds of diets. They fall into two categories. They're the more severe, or what I call ketogenic diets, like the Atkins diet, which severely restricts carbohydrates. And then there are the less severe kinds of diets that don't put you into ketosis, but they get you to lose weight by applying all kinds of rules so that you limit the amount of food you eat. They're portion-controlled diets with a whole bunch of complicated rules. And there are several of each kind of these diets, but I want to focus on two of the most popular. Let's focus on the Atkins diet, which is the ultimate in the ketogenic diet. And let's focus on the zone diet, which has been a very popular portion-controlled diet. Now, the way the Atkins diet works is you totally exclude carbohydrate. That's the original basic diet of Dr. Robert Atkins. You get it all out of your diet. Carbohydrates are evil. And what happens is when you get the carbohydrate out of your diet, your body doesn't have its usual preferred fuel, which is carbohydrate. Instead, it has to burn fat. So it burns fat from your body, it burns fat from your food. A byproduct of fat burning is ketones. And so when you're on these diets, you check your urine to make sure there are ketones in your urine. Well, when ketones appear in your blood and your body, what happens is they suppress your appetite so you lose weight. So here's how the diet works, and this is why it's so successful. You go on the diet, you eliminate all carbohydrates. Well, the body prefers carbohydrates, and as you'll learn in a few minutes, the body actually requires carbohydrates, has to have them. So what the body does first is it takes 2 pounds of carbohydrate that's stored in your body invisibly, in the liver and in the muscles, and it burns up those 2 pounds of carbohydrate over the next 18 to 72 hours. Now, mixed up with that 2 pounds of carbohydrate are 4 pounds of water. So you just lost 6 pounds within a day or two. And you go, wow, this is the greatest diet I've ever been on. Well, it's been basically water. And then when you go into this ketone state, there's lots of acids produced in your body, and you lose a lot more water because the body's trying to get rid of the acid. And then the ketosis sets in from all the ketones in your body. You can smell it on your breath. It smells like acetone. You can measure it in the urine. And what happens is ketones suppress the hunger drive. You see, this is a natural mechanism that's built into people for times of survival. Ketosis occurs naturally when you get sick. When you get sick, you're supposed to be recuperating. You're not supposed to be gathering and preparing food. And so if you're sick for a period of time, and significantly sick, what happens is the body goes into ketosis, and you get a chance to just rest and recover. The other time that ketosis occurs is when people starve to death. I mean, it's very painful to starve to death. It takes a couple of months. So the first couple of days is very painful. That's all you can think about is food. And then after about 3 or 4 days, you go into ketosis, and that relieves the pain of suffering of dying from starvation. It's a survival mechanism, a survival adaptation the body goes through. So you can at least try and figure out how to keep yourself alive instead of just focused on food all the time after you go into ketosis. Now, because this diet works by a mechanism that naturally occurs when people get sick, I call this a make-yourself-sick diet. And because this kind of diet is associated with short-term and long-term illnesses, I can further emphasize that the Atkins kind of diet is a make-yourself-sick diet. Now, the kind of diet like the Zone, what they do is they introduce complicated rules that you have to follow. And as a result, you eliminate a lot of junk food, which is good, and so do you on the Atkins diet. You eliminate a lot of cakes and sugars and cookies and things like that, which is all good. And they also make certain kinds of rules that cause you to just take in fewer calories. And I'll talk to you about this in a little bit more detail. But they don't cause you to go into ketosis. Let's talk about the Atkins diet. The premise of the Atkins diet is the problem people have is they develop high insulin in their body, but insulin's job is to take and push sugar into your cells so that your body has energy to burn. It pushes fat into your fat cells and stores that fat for the day when no food's available, causes the body to synthesize protein. Well, because it pushes fat into fat cells, what these kinds of diets say is that insulin's obviously an evil hormone because insulin makes you fat. Well, it's supposed to. It's not supposed to make you fat, but it's supposed to make you store calories. Well, insulin is not an evil hormone, but that's the premise of their diet. And what they say is that when you eat carbohydrate, what happens is it makes the insulin go real high, and therefore you can't possibly lose weight and be healthy and trim. But that, of course, is not true. One of the things that they ignore completely is the scientific research that says that eating these high-protein diets causes as much insulin production as eating things like pasta or breads or porridge. So their basic premise is really flawed. The solution to the problem, according to them, is to get all the carbohydrate out of the diet, which is supposed to get the insulin down, which it really doesn't do. And what really works is they develop ketosis and they lose their appetite, as I just told you. The results that are published, the first paper, and the one that stood for a long time, was published in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association in 1980 on the Atkins diet. It's still one of the best studies done on this kind of diet. Well, what that study shows is the Atkins diet raises your total cholesterol. It raises your bad cholesterol. Now, that stood for many, many years until Dr. Atkins was challenged that his diet didn't have scientific research to show, number one, it worked, and number two, it was safe. And so his foundation went out and hired people to do studies to show that his diet not only worked, but was safe. And I reviewed those studies, and my conclusion was that their results reflected deceit and disappointment. You could go to my website and you can read a thorough review that I did on all the research published on the Atkins diet recently, and you'll see that this is very deceitful and the results are extremely disappointing following this kind of diet. But to hear the hype, you'd think it was the most wonderful thing in the world. But look at your friends and relatives. They may lose some weight initially, but long-term, do they? And the question is, do they look healthy? I don't think so. That's not what I've seen. I did a debate in 2000. It was in front of the United States Department of Agriculture. I was invited to participate in the Great Nutrition Debate. And Dr. Robert Atkins was there, as well as the other people who were involved in the diet industry and popular. And while I was preparing for the debate, I talked to my greatest confidant, my best advisor, and that's Mary. And I said, Mary, I'll tell you what I plan to do. What I plan to do is, as this debate is going along, I know what Dr. Robert Atkins is going to say. He's going to say that my diet is easy to follow and highly effective. And I said, Mary, when he says that, I'm going to jump up and I'm going to say, okay, Chubby, stand up and take off your coat and let us see how easy it is to follow and how effective it is. And Mary says, you can't do that. That'd be too negative. To this date, there's a part of me that regrets not doing that. As a matter of fact, as some of you probably remember, this was all released just recently in the year 2004, February 2004, his medical reports, which showed he was grossly overweight. It did have serious disease, including serious cardiovascular disease. Unfortunately, the man has died, but the records still stand. During this debate, something interesting happened. I was one of the few presenters who stood up and gave his presentation. And I understand why, because the other people who were presenting the diet information didn't look good. They looked very pudgy and very unhealthy, and so they sat behind the desk in their microphone. Well, because I was the only presenter that stood up, I got my picture taken. And as a consequence, I had a chance to be in the next issue of Newsweek magazine. You can see my picture there. It's not because I was the most popular or most important dietary doctor out there. It was only because I was the only one that would stand up and give his presentation. That's a very interesting article that they did. And if you see the bottom of the article, you notice that it is lined with pork rinds. And one of the jokes, which is not really a joke, it's really true, is that Dr. Atkins says you eat pork rinds to be healthy. But when people look at this particular article, and they see these pictures and the relationship of the pictures going on there, and they see that pork rind up at the top, they will ask this question: did Dr. McDougall really throw a pork rind at Dr. Atkins' head during the debate? I refuse to answer that. Let's talk about the zone diet, a very popular diet. The zone diet, its premise is the imbalance of protein to carbohydrate produces excess insulin and bad little tiny hormones called eicosanoids. Not important to go into that. But basically it's a problem of excess insulin, again the evil hormone, which by the way is elevated, I'll repeat again, is elevated as much when you eat beef and chicken and cheese as when you eat pasta. Because that's basically what's supposed to happen. When you eat, is insulin is supposed to be secreted. So their basic premise is contradicted by the scientific evidence. Well, the solution, according to the author of this particular diet, Barry Sears, is to determine the amount of protein that you need. And he has charts in his book to make that determination based upon your activity level and your body size. And then what you do after you find out how much protein you need is you take and you evenly distribute the amount of calories you eat in this proportion. You eat 30% of your calories as protein, 30% as fat, and 40% as carbohydrate. They're known as 30-30-40 diets. Very popular over the last 10 years. Millions of people have followed these kinds of diets. The results published in the scientific literature on these diets are essentially none. Well, I had an opportunity to debate Barry Sears. He's a doctor of chemistry, not a medical doctor. I had a chance to debate him on 3 occasions. The first occasion was in Las Vegas, and on that occasion I prepared a debate that I think surprised him a bit. During the debate, I took a tack that I think was rather original, and you may not find very kind, but what I said is I believe the zone diet is a semi-starvation diet. And I believe it's near impossible. Why is it near impossible? Because when you are semi-starving all the time, you're hungry all the time, and the hunger drive gets the best of you, and you decide you have to eat. That's why so many people fail on diets, is they get hungry. That's why you need to find a diet where you can eat as much as you want, a food that not only causes you to be trim, but also healthy, which is the kind of diet that we're teaching you. So I said, and I think it's near impossible to follow, and as an example of that, I'm going to use my opponent in this debate, the author of The Zone, Dr. Barry Sears. Now, Dr. Sears tells us in his book that he's 6'5" and 210 pounds. Well, my guess is he weighed a lot more than 210 pounds when he was facing me on that stage in Las Vegas, but let's let that go aside. He said he'd been following the zone diet for 4 to 5 years. These are the facts that are given in this book. The diet is 30% protein, 30% fat, and 40% carbohydrate. And according to the charts in his book and his statements, based upon his size, his activity level, he eats 100 grams of protein a day. Now, please follow the math. There are 4 calories in every gram of protein. So if he eats 100 grams of protein a day, that means he eats 400 calories of protein a day. Now, the distribution of his diet is 30% protein, 30% fat, and 40% carbohydrates. So when you divide those calories out, what you find is he eats 30% protein, which is 400 calories. He eats 30% of his calories as fat, which is 400 calories. And he eats 40% carbohydrate, which is 500 calories. So if you add all those together, you see his total daily calorie intake is 1,300 calories. Now, Barry Sears is 6'5" and 210 pounds. He eats 1,300 calories a day for the past 4 to 5 years. Conservatively, that man's calorie needs are 2,300 calories a day if he sits in a chair and sleeps all the time just to keep his heart and lungs going. That means his deficit, if you do the math now, his deficit is 1,000 calories a day. The difference between 2,300 and 1,300 calories is 1,000 calories a day. That means his deficit is 7,000 calories a week. Now, about that time, Dr. Sears is getting a little concerned as we're standing on stage together. Where is he going next, his question is. Well, 1 pound of fat is 3,500 calories. Barry Sears' deficit is 7,000 calories a week. That means his weekly weight loss is 2 pounds. His yearly weight loss is 104 pounds, which means his total weight loss is 400 to 500 pounds. Now, he wasn't looking too good at that point. So I looked over at him and I said, Barry, I said, I'm going to ask you a question. And I said, I'm not going to let you get off the stage until you answer it. I said, because the health of the people listening here depends upon your answer. And so I'm going to ask you a question. Don't try and get around it. My possible conclusions are, Barry Sears, you started at over 600 pounds. You defy the laws of nature, or you cannot and do not follow the zone diet. And I want an answer. Is it A, B, or C? This was not a pleasant moment for the man. So he squirmed and wiggled and tried to refuse to answer, and he finally did answer. At the end of the debate, he basically said, I don't follow the diet. I can't possibly. The math is right there. Wow. Yeah. So we had 3 debates scheduled. The next one was scheduled in Boston a couple months later. And I decided that I had to figure out what was going on. And by the way, I prepare very well when I meet somebody in a debate. You can count on it. I know everything I can about this person, everything scientifically. I know about their personal life. I know everything I can about them, because I'm not going to stand up there on stage and not be prepared. Not just because I care about my personal appearance on stage and how I come across, but I figure I have an obligation to you folks. How else are you going to tell who's telling the truth unless you have somebody stand up and question what's going on? And so with that obligation in mind, I make great preparation. So we have this debate scheduled in Boston. And I said, now where is this man going to go? What could he possibly do? Because he knows I'm going to go through the same kind of discussion, the same scenario, the same math, and he's got to answer me. So I knew he was interested in good fats. So what I figured is he's going to tell me he doesn't eat 2,300 calories a day. Or excuse me, he doesn't eat 1,300 calories a day. He eats 2,300 or more, and what he does is he makes up for it with good fats. And so I went out and I bought myself a bottle of olive oil. And I calculated for him to make up that deficit, he would have to raise his fat intake of his diet to 65%. He would have to eat 12.5 tablespoons of olive oil, which is 5.5 ounces of olive oil. And I bought this bottle of olive oil. And when he got to the point of his presentation where he told the folks in the audience, 2,000 people in Boston, listening to his presentation, he said, well, Dr. McDougall, you are right. Obviously, I couldn't just eat 1,300 calories a day. I make it up with good fats, and you would too if you knew how important they were in your diet. And I said, well, Barry, that's pretty neat. Guess what? I just brought you a bottle of good fat, olive oil. It's 5.5 ounces, which you're going to have to consume every day to make up for that calorie deficit. I said, here's the bottle. Would you like to drink this for us? I said, I think you'd find it very disgusting if you did get sick right here on stage. Well, I have to tell you, the moderator of the debate was not very happy with my technique. He thought I was actually cruel. And so something interesting happened, and that is the technician dropped my slides. That's back when we used slides. And I said, well, my slides, I can't go on. And the moderator of the debate says, too bad. Your time's still rolling. And I looked over at Barry and I said, Barry, what are we going to do? I said, I can't continue with the debate. I said, how are we going to entertain these people? I said, Barry, I got a good idea. I said, why don't we take off our shirts and show them what we're really made of? He just smiled. Our third debate was scheduled in Orlando, and he canceled it. And I asked the folks from Orlando, why did he cancel it? And basically the response that I heard, and I'll just paraphrase it, is he said, why should I put up with this kind of abuse? So I figured that we were done in our debating career, and actually we did meet another time in front of the USDA, as I showed you a few minutes ago. But we had one other opportunity to get together, and that was in the Virgin Islands. I was invited to come down and debate at the World Presidents Organization. These people had a big budget. They could take really good care of us. And they called up and they said, we'd like to hear a debate about high-protein diets. Would you come, and would you get somebody else that believes the opposite to come with you so that we could debate? And I said, well, you can pick anybody you want. I don't really care. Well, you know, it's up to you. And I said, well, there's one guy I'm all prepared for. I've spent, you know, days, if not months, getting ready to debate this guy. I said, but I don't think he'll come. Well, they asked Barry Sears, Dr. Sears, if he'd come. And he agreed. I guess the temptation was great. So we had this debate scheduled. And I thought, no, you know, this man knows exactly what I'm going to do. Where is he going to go next? At about that time, he had a new book out called The Zone Anti-Aging Diet. And he talked about the way to prevent aging is you don't eat very many calories. And this is based on work that shows if you take animals and restrict their calorie intake, what happens is that these animals live longer. This is a mechanism for species survival. If you don't have enough food, if you can live longer, increase your reproductive time of the species, then you have a better chance that the species will survive. So his idea, as it has been for many other people, is just eat less calories and therefore you're going to live longer. And so he had this new anti-aging zone book out. And in preparation for our next debate, I did go to his website and I did read some of the emails. And he would get letters from some of his followers that say, did you read the stuff on the website, Dr. McDougall's website, about the debates he did with you in the past? About how he said that you cannot and do not follow your own diet or you must have weighed 500 pounds? I said, how do you answer that man? And Barry says, you know, if Dr. McDougall was a little smarter about things, he'd know that it really is wise to eat a low-calorie diet because you'll live longer. And so really, I only do eat 1,300 calories a day. And I thought, oh boy, where are we going now? He only eats 1,300 calories a day. How am I going to deal with this? So we went through the first two arguments about how he cannot and does not follow his diet, how he has to eat 1,300 calories a day, and how he tells me, through the same scenario, that really does is eat an extra 5.5 ounces of olive oil, I expected him to say. But he couldn't go there because I would challenge him, you couldn't really drink that much olive oil. So I waited and expected his response to be based on his new book. And I prepared too, I'll have to say. I prepared the following. It's based on a story that happened to me when I lived in Hawaii. When I lived in Hawaii, there was a health food advocate who was known as a breatharian. Now, a breatharian lives off air. They don't drink water. They don't eat food. They get everything from the air. Now, unfortunately, our breatharian was caught sneaking down to 7-Eleven buying Snickers bars and Hostess Twinkies. And that was reported in the paper. So in preparation for my next meeting with Dr. Barry Sears, I put together this newspaper headline. I put together a headline that says a breatharian was caught eating hamburgers and candy bars. And I asked Barry Sears, if you live on 1,300 calories a day, is it possible now that the zone diet is an air diet? Maybe you become a breatharian? I said, because if you weren't active, you'd burn 2,400 calories a day just sitting. And with any activity, you'd burn 2,700 calories a day. How do you make up these calories? How do you make up that deficit? Well, that's the last time we've gotten together. He's a very nice man, very intelligent man, but I think he's fooled people with his dietary approach and unfortunately kept them from the kind of diet that they really need to follow to get the health and personal appearance, long-term personal appearance that they deserve, as I feel about the other folks who recommend these low-carbohydrate, high-protein, high-fat diets. Let me tell you a little bit about the wonders of carbohydrate. Your friends will tell you, as so will these diet gurus, that carbohydrates are bad for you. They're evil. Don't eat rice, turns to sugar, makes you fat. And so what are you going to say? Well, up till now, you may not have known what to say, but when I finish, you'll know exactly what to say. And you'll never have anybody threaten you with that kind of statement ever again, because you'll be armed with correct and easy to understand information. Calories are provided by carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Carbohydrate is the primary preferred fuel of the body. The body burns fat in times of deprivation. In other words, fat is the metabolic dollar that's stored when no food's available, and so it will burn it when nothing else is available. It burns it sometimes during daily activity, but it really prefers burning carbohydrate. And the body will burn protein as a last desperate effort to keep you alive, even though all three will provide calories. Carbohydrates are found in plants. Bananas, 95% of the calories are carbohydrate. Beans, 72%, broccoli, 71%, corn, 85%, potatoes, 90%. Carbohydrates are plants. In fact, it's almost interchangeable. If you say plant foods, you say carbohydrate foods. There are no low carbohydrate plant foods, except for maybe avocados, which are kind of high in fat, but they still have carbohydrates. Animal foods are carbohydrate deficient foods. There's no carbohydrate in beef, chicken, fish, lobster. Cheese, 2% of the calories are carbohydrate. These are the foods that you want to avoid, these low carbohydrate foods. Your oils like olive oil, corn oil, safflower oil, 0 carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are found in very appealing foods, the ones that you enjoy eating, the ones that you have a very positive reaction to, and they're the ones that are good for your health. Now, how do you stand up to this misinformation? What you need to do is just open your eyes and just observe what's going on. Most of the things that I'm going to tell you, you're already familiar with. Maybe you've forgotten it from the past. Maybe it just needs to be refreshed in your mind a little bit. But first of all, people have unique needs for carbohydrates. You all know, or at least I'm sure you learned at one time or another in your science background, that the tip of the tongue tastes with pleasure carbohydrate. Why do you think those taste buds are there? Why do you think the sweet-tasting taste buds are there? It's because you are designed as a seeker of carbohydrate. I have told you that a cat doesn't have those kinds of taste buds. They have taste buds for protein for a very important reason. They're supposed to eat low-carbohydrate, high-protein animal foods, but we are designed as seekers of carbohydrate. So next time somebody says, well, carbohydrate's bad for you, you go, stick out your tongue. Then tell them the story. The tongue also tastes with pleasure salt. And salt really is a necessary ingredient in your system. Once upon a time, it was lots of minerals that were supplied for your body needs. Very important for nutrition. Now today, of course, they pack salt in salt shakers and they put it in all kinds of foods because they know you like it. Why do you think manufacturers put it in there? Same thing with sweetness and sugar. They put it in the food because they know you like it. Because physiologically, you're designed to seek these kinds of things. Your appetite is satisfied by carbohydrate. They've done multiple experiments where they fed people either high protein or high carbohydrate foods, and they find that fat, these high protein, high fat foods, the fat in these foods provides almost no satiety, satisfaction. They do that by, they give people different kinds of meals or snacks, and they ask them, well, how do you feel? Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat? Ask them all kinds of questions. What they find when they feed them fatty foods is they experience almost no satisfaction from the meal plan. They feed carbohydrates, those substances in plant foods, they get satisfaction for hours after they eat. And that's good because you don't want to think about food all the time. You want to get on to the other important parts of your life. In one particular study, they compared the satiety score of various kinds of foods, and they found that potatoes were one of the most satisfying foods that people eat. They are twice as satisfying as beef and cheese when they did this kind of test. The brain burns 20% of the calories that you eat. And one of the important things for you to understand is the brain prefers carbohydrate for its energy. In fact, only under desperate situations will the brain burn fatty acids to stay alive. Otherwise, it wants carbohydrate. 20% of your calories. And one of the limitations of low carbohydrate diets is the fact that you've got to get that 20% of calories to make the brain happy. And there have been studies done on these very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets that show that brain function is compromised when you're in a state of ketosis. And there's serious concern if you put developing animals, in other words, babies, and they've done this with baby animals, you put them on these diets that cause ketosis to occur, these ketogenic diets, that brain development will not be proper. These animals will end up with brain deficit, and the concern is that children will have the same kind of problem from being on these ketogenic diets because the fuel's not there for the brain. And then there are cells in the body that won't burn anything else but carbohydrate, like your red blood cells. They absolutely have to have carbohydrate. Kidney cells, certain kidney cells are the same way. They must have carbohydrate. So what happens when you eat one of these bizarre diets that has no carbohydrate in it, or you don't eat at all for a period of time? And you have cells in the body that prefer or absolutely demand carbohydrate. Well, the body makes its own carbohydrate by a very expensive process that is only resorted to in times of desperation. It's called gluconeogenesis, in other words, the new production of glucose. It takes protein and converts it into carbohydrates so that these tissues can stay alive. That's how important carbohydrate is to you. And as I've shared with you, the body does not take carbohydrate and turn it into fat under usual circumstances. It's just a wasteful thing for the body to do. And so when these diet gurus who teach low carbohydrate diets tell you that you don't want to eat rice because it makes you fat, you say, wait a minute, do you know about the fact that the body does not convert sugar into fat under usual circumstances? And then spring the word on them. Do you know about de novo lipogenesis? You'll get them thinking twice after that one. There are three things about carbohydrate that cause you to lose weight effortlessly. One is that carbohydrates are very dilute in their calories. I demonstrate this for you with these particular beakers here, which represent the size of your stomach. And what you see in these different stomachs is you see high carbohydrate foods, in this case potatoes, corn, rice. They fill up the stomach with 500 calories. Each contains 500 calories. They're very calorie dilute. They're very bulky. When you look at meat or cheese or butter, which are on the bottom, what you see is these are very calorie dense foods. As a matter of fact, when you switch from high carbohydrate foods to the calorie dense, high protein, high fat foods, you change the calorie concentration fourfold. In other words, there's 1/4 as many calories in a high carbohydrate food than there is in, say, meat or cheese or oils or other of those low carbohydrate foods. The second thing about the carbohydrate foods is that they're very low in fat. And the fat you eat is the fat you wear. So if you're eating foods that have almost no fat in them, then there's no fat to go into your fatty tissues. And the third thing, as I touched on, it's carbohydrate that satisfies your hunger drive. And remember, carbohydrate is essentially non-existent in your meat products. Now let's take a look around the world for a minute. This is something that you can observe and again challenge your friends with. Worldwide, people on high carbohydrate diets are thin and healthy looking. You've seen this. You've seen it in your travels. You've seen it on travel logs on television. You go to the airports and you watch people walk through. When you see people who live on high carbohydrate diets, they look great. For example, the Asian people. In Japan, the word for cooked rice is the same word for meal. And the word for breakfast is the same word for morning rice. In China, the same word for food is rice. And they have a saying in China. They say a meal without rice is like a beautiful woman with only one eye. Remember that one and try it on a friend sometime. And in China, instead of saying, hello, how are you? They say, have you had your rice today? In India, the first food cooked by a new bride for her husband is rice. And in Indonesia, you can't get married until you know how to skillfully prepare rice. Now, how could that food be so bad when it supports more than 1 billion people in excellent health who are more active, younger looking, trimmer than the people who eat a low rice diet, who avoid the diseases that are common to the people who eat a diet that's high in protein, high in fat, and low in carbohydrate. And that's what you see when you look around the world. You can pick many, many countries. People who eat high fat, high protein, low carbohydrate diets are fat, they're sick. People who eat high carbohydrate, low fat diets are trim and healthy and active. And that's the way you want to be. And you can make that change in yourself. It has nothing to do with your race. It has nothing to do with your country of origin. It has to do with what you've learned. If I was looking for an ideal diet for an animal, I would look for the optimal performers. Like if I was looking for the ideal diet for a horse, if I owned a horse, I'd look for the optimal diet for racehorses that win races. And I'd say, well, obviously if they can perform to that peak performance, then that should be the best diet for all horses. And I think we can take and expand that same kind of thinking to people. If you want to find the best diet for you, say a housewife, or you, somebody who works in an engineering plant and doesn't really get a lot of physical activity, wouldn't you want to look at people who really extend the capabilities, the abilities of the human body to the ultimate? And those are our athletes. Those are the winners of the races. And what do those people eat? The winners of the races eat carbohydrate. You will find no marathon runners, no triathlon runners, no long-distance swimmers who eat a low-carbohydrate diet. I've had a chance to work with several of these people. Mary All is one example. She's a lady who actually wears McDougall t-shirts and McDougall hats in her races. But it wasn't that way for her in the past. She had terrible asthma. She could hardly complete a marathon. And then she learned about our diet, started following our diet, and now she wins between number 2 and number 8 in world competitions for triathlons. And she brags and writes about how it was the McDougall diet that gave her that edge that caused her to become a winner. Ruth Heydrich is one of my first patients. Ruth Heydrich is a very interesting woman. She was an athlete. Ruth Heydrich ran marathons in Hawaii. Back about 22 years ago, she'd been running marathons for almost 12 years. She came to my office with a terrible story. She'd just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and it had spread to her lungs. And she loved life. She wanted to stay alive. And she asked me if there was anything that she could do. And I said, well, you know, I know a few things about diet and breast cancer, and I'd like to share these things with you. And she was a doubting person, or my story wasn't very convincing back then. I said, well, fine, why don't you read the literature yourself? And I sat her down in my office, and I said, okay, here's what I have found in the scientific research on the relationship between diet and breast cancer. Read it. So she spent a couple of days in my office and read the research, left, and said, that's what I'll eat. Here we are 22 years later. She is a world-class triathlon winner. Her goal is this year she's going to win her 1,000th gold medal for triathlon. She wears the stickers from the various companies to promote their products. She is so successful. And she's 70 years old. Probably the most famous athlete I had a chance to take care of is this man. I was in Minneapolis doing a show called Twin Cities Live. And we were sitting in the green room together, and he says to me, you know, I can't keep my weight off. And whenever I try a diet, the problem is I lose all my performance. I said, well, Carl Lewis, I got an answer for you. I said, why don't you do this? And I explained to him why it would work. And Carl Lewis started the McDougall diet in 1990. Subsequent to that, he set the world record for the 100-meter dash. He did the 3 best long jumps that have ever been done. He won 3 gold medals, and he tells people that when he followed the McDougall diet, a pure low-fat vegan diet, it was the best performance of all of his career. And it's kind of interesting, still to this day, he follows the diet. He just put out a cookbook called Very Vegetarian, and in the introduction, he mentions where he learned the diet, from Dr. McDougall. Let's take a look at the opposite extreme. They did a test on the Canadian Army. They did it during World War II. There's a ration that the Army gets. It's called pemmican. And it's 70% fat and 30% protein, very similar to the Atkins diet. And what they did is they asked them to eat the diet, and then they observed them. And what they found is they were incapacitated within 3 days. They complained of nausea and vomiting. On the 4th day, the doctors examined the soldiers. They found them listless, dehydrated, with drawn faces, sunken eyes. Their breath smelled of acetone, that's the ketosis, and they could not perform their duties. And they put them back on carbohydrates, and their function returned. How about religious teachings? What do they tell us that we ought to eat? They tell us we should eat a plant-based diet. For example, in Genesis, you have, God said, behold, I have given you every plant-yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit-yielding seed, and it shall be your food. The Mormon doctrine, all grain is ordained for use of man and of beasts, and these, speaking of the meats, hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess hunger. Mormon Doctrine 89. This one from the Hindus is kind of interesting and also threatening. Karmic consequences by involving oneself in the cycle of inflicting injury, pain, and death, even indirectly by eating other creatures, one must in the future experience in equal measure the suffering caused. Now, if that's not a threat for you, I don't know what could be. And Buddha says to become a vegetarian is to step into the stream which leads to nirvana. I don't know any religious teachings that tell you to eat a low plant food diet. I've just never seen it. And one of my favorites comes from the Bible. It's a story actually of my medical practice. It takes place 2,500 years ago. It's Daniel talking to his overseer. Daniel says to his overseer, let's do an experiment. Let's take my men who are sick and let's feed them vegetables and water. and then compare them to the other guys in the castle who are eating the rich food and see what happens. Now, agreed, it was not a double-blind, placebo-controlled experiment. But I challenge you, it has lasted the test of time. It was not a true story, one that people could relate to and learn things from. They had thrown it out of the Bible. And so, they agreed to this, and they tested them for 10 days. Do you get the significance? We run a 10-day live-in program. At the end of 10 days, they look healthier and better nourished than any of the young men that ate the royal food. How about your major health organizations? They unanimously support a plant food-based diet. You have the United States Department of Agriculture guidelines. They've recently come out with the food pyramid. And if you look at it carefully, what you see is the McDougall diet there. You see they have a base of starches. The next tier up is fruits and vegetables. And then they tell you you can have some meat and dairy products. Then at the top, the very tip of the pyramid, they tell you you can eat almost anything. Well, that's to placate industry and also their own personal eating habits. If you want the truth based on the research, what you do is you take the top of the pyramid, you lop it off, and you have what I call the McDougall trapezoid, a starch-based diet with fruits and vegetables. The World Health Organization says eat a nutritious diet based on a variety of foods originating mainly in plants rather than animals. The American Cancer Society, eat a variety of healthful foods with an emphasis on plant sources. Limit consumption of red meats, especially those high in fat and those that are processed. And even the dietitians, they're also on the proper road to good nutrition and advice. It is the position of the American Dietetic Association and dietitians in Canada that appropriately planned vegetarian diets are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. So you have all of your learned professionals telling you the same direction. You hear this from every place you go. The only question you have is the one of degree. If everybody's telling you more fruits, more vegetables, less meat, less oil, less processed food, what you need to do is step back and say, how much more and how much less? Now that's a personal decision. For me, I think you ought to take the most of the best and the least of the worst. It only makes sense. It's like, for example, you come and you ask advice from me. You say, Dr. McDougall, I love these lungs. I don't want to get lung cancer. I'm tired of wheezing. I don't want to get emphysema. How many cigarettes should I smoke? Now, you could probably tolerate 2 or 5. But there's only one good answer a good doctor would give you, right? It's the same thing with the food. If somebody tells you the plant foods are good for you and these animal foods are bad for you, what's the only responsible advice you ought to be getting from health professionals? This is what you need to do. Now, what you choose to do is an entirely different issue. It never bothers me if people have the correct information and then they choose to live a little bit more dangerously. That's your life. But to give you the incorrect information, that's wrong. And we have the knowledge. The science is there to offer people correct information. It's just contaminated by money, by egos, by previous eating habits of the people who are forming the policies. That's the problem. Carbohydrate foods provide excellent nutrition for people. They're the ideal food for people. Let me tell you how ideal they are in their simplest form. You can survive on potatoes alone. In fact, there have been populations of people at the turn of the 19th century in Poland and Russia where their entire nutrition came from potatoes. Let me tell you about an experiment that was done. It was an experiment done in 1925. It was called the potato diet experiment, and it involved 2 healthy adults, a man 25 and a woman 28, and these were very active people. They were equivalent to marathon runners of these days. And they kept these people on a diet where essentially all of their nutrition, all their proteins, vitamins, minerals, fats, everything came from potatoes. White potatoes. Now, I have to qualify that for a minute. They did run into a little bit of trouble, and that is because they were so active and they were losing so much weight, they had to add oil to the diet. By adding oil, you added empty calories. In other words, no protein, no vitamins, no minerals. So they diluted the nutritional quality of the potatoes by adding the oil. But still, at the end of the experiment, they said that these people did not tire of the uniform potato diet, and there was no craving for change. Interesting. fully satisfied, very content on an all-potato diet. And the more important thing is they were in good health on a diet in which the nitrogen, in other words protein, was practically solely derived from potatoes. That's how simple your diet can be. These foods are complete long before they hit the dinner table. Now, am I recommending you eat an all-potato diet or only potato diet? No. I'm just trying to give you some sense as to the completeness of these foods. Now, you can do that with potatoes and sweet potatoes and other root starches. You will have a problem if you eat rice or beans as your sole starch. You'll be deficient in A and C. And in that case, you can add a piece of broccoli a day or an orange a day to add that supplement of A and C. But there are foods that will add complete nutrition. Let me just tell you another interesting example. In Peru, there are children who are orphaned. They have no mothers, they have no surrogate mothers, they have no source of human breast milk because of the poverty. They can't afford to buy regular infant formula for these orphan children, and so they make a formula out of white potatoes. Now, they do have to add oil, again, which dilutes out the nutritional content of the potatoes. But they raise these little babies from 8 months of age on a diet where all the nutrition comes from potatoes. And they have normal growth patterns. Of course, you know Peru is the country of potatoes, right? They have 400 different species of potatoes. And by the way, the people in Peru today have the same health figures that we had in the 1900s. The same low risk of heart disease and so on, because they still eat primarily a starch-based diet. Another excellent example of trim, healthy, hearty people who live on starch, carbohydrate. So your carbohydrate foods, they give you the kind of balanced nutrition you've been looking for. You know these terms. You know that's what you've wanted in your diet. You wanted a diet that's high carbohydrate, high fiber, low fats. You want good fats in your diet, and that's what comes from plant foods. You want all your vitamins and minerals, and I've told you that 11 of the 13 vitamins come from plants. They're made by plants. Your minerals come through plants to get to you. They're moderate in protein. They contain all your essential amino acids. They have no cholesterol. They're low sodium. They're high potassium, low in microbes like viruses, bacteria, and they're low in environmental contamination. They're ideal foods for you. And once you put it all together, I'm sure you can see that. I've rated some of the diets, and I've done it in kind of a target, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. At the very extreme, you have the Krispy Kreme diet. But I have to point out that the human body is so strong that it will survive for a period of time on Krispy Kreme donuts and colas. And it lives. But that's about the worst you can get. And as you move into these low carbohydrate, high protein diets, and then you get to the well-balanced American diet, and then you move into diets that are similar to the one I recommend, which is the Kempner diet from Duke University, where they did all the things that I'm teaching you about. They did it back in the 40s and 50s. Essentially, everything I'm sharing with you has been published in the scientific literature by 1955. The decrease in blood pressure, cholesterol, the decrease in heart size, the improvement in heart function. All of these wonders were well established at Duke University and published in the scientific literature by Dr. Kempner. We have diets like the Pritikin diet, the macrobiotic diet, all similar diets which approach that ideal diet. I believe we're very close to the optimal diet. And I believe it's very important that you know what the optimal diet is. That should be a task for every person, every parent, every school teacher, every scientist, to be able to answer the question, what is the optimal diet for people? You owe it to your family. You owe it to yourself to know what that is. There has to be an answer out there. What is that optimal diet? Yet we've really disregarded that question, and we've allowed ourselves and our family to eat almost anything and everything. And as a matter of fact, we feed family members and ourselves things you wouldn't feed to your animals. In fact, the Humane Society would go after you if you fed ice cream cones to your dog. This would be abuse to the animals, and yet somehow we think we're allowed to do these things to ourselves. And the ones we love most, it makes no sense. My final challenge to you is this. I hope we have satisfied the answer to this question, but this is the challenge. And that is, there must be an optimal diet for you, just like there is for a horse, or a dog, or a cat, or a parrot. They have optimal diets, and I wouldn't take my parrot and feed it meat, and I wouldn't take my cat and feed it walnuts. Just makes no sense at all. I love these animals. I know what they're supposed to eat. And I know you love the people around you. And they're much more important to you than your animals. And so your effort from this point on is to find that ideal for those people you love. And I believe we've shared that diet with you during these presentations. The ideal diet for human beings is a diet based on starch with the addition of fruits and vegetables, and you keep those feasts for a special occasion only. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Great. Thank you. It's really good. Thank you.